I guess, where do you want to start it, Ron?
So, I mean, I think the obvious place to start is what happened this afternoon. Donald Trump, president-elect, summoned leaders from this community to a meeting at Trump Tower that included all of his adult children, by the way, at the table. It's kind of an interesting little detail. After an election in which, by the calculations of the Center for Responsive Politics, this community, broadly speaking, contributed $32 to Hillary Clinton for every dollar they contributed to Donald Trump. If you look around the country at the centers of the new economy, in Silicon Valley, Seattle, Portland, Hillary Clinton won 3/4 of the vote. In Boston, 3/4 of the vote. In San Francisco, over 80% of the vote. Austin, 2/3 of the vote.
Don't forget Oakland.
Oakland, yeah. So pretty much everywhere you looked, whether it was the dollars or the votes, it was very lopsided. What explains that gulf, in your view? Is it fundamentally values, or is it interests? Is there an economic gap between their visions of what makes the economy work? Is it a question of personal values? Why was this community in such a different place than many voters elsewhere?
So, first of all, I just want to note, I just looked at the picture of the CEOs at Trump Tower. It looks like they were at a funeral.
Yeah.
Just take a look at that. But there's a couple aspects. One, it's not just, I think we think too much it's just Silicon Valley, but it's almost every city had, there's real dichotomies between cities and the rural countryside. And so I'm originally from small town, middle of nowhere, corn, soybeans, Illinois, you know? Like, we have the largest Walmart in the state of Illinois. That's like the best thing I can tell you. And while I love my hometown, you know, diversity and things like that, there was one black family and one Jewish family, and the values are just so different than, say, in not just Silicon Valley, but in New York, in Los Angeles, in any major metropolitan area. And, you know, I think especially in Silicon Valley, you have this value for how can we, you know, support gay rights, fundamental rights. There's a stronger bent towards positive civil rights and seeing technology as a place for democratization of those rights. And it's not the same kind of thing, I would say, in rural areas. You don't have the same kind of issues. You don't have the same kind of things because, honestly, there's not as much diversity issues that you might have to deal with in the countryside than the city. I think the other thing is that you see, like in Silicon Valley, we are solving our own problems. That's part of the mantra of Silicon Valley, right? You know, solve your own problems. But we're solving the problems of city people, and that, you know, Ubers and Postmates and other products like that. They're fantastic, but they're not solving the problems of the rest of the country, and it just created a greater disconnect than we realized until November.
You know, to your point, Hillary Clinton won 88 of the 100 largest counties in America and won fewer than 1/6 of all the counties overall. She won fewer counties than anyone who's ever won the popular vote, I think, without question. But go ahead. What explains the gap?
The other thing that, of course, explains it is, so there's the social issues, which I agree with, and Silicon Valley's making products for itself with problems it understands. I think that's piece one. And I think piece two is the real issue around immigration and economic growth and the philosophy of the Valley, right, that everything is open. Everything is open, right? So that fundamental mindset, you know, borders are open, talent should flow easily across borders, products should flow easily across borders, services should flow easily across borders, against a kind of very populist sentiment, right, and a protectionism sentiment. So I think, and again, there's a divide there because, you know, we sort of predicate growth on opening up things globally. I mean, when you go to an average company in Silicon Valley, it's about, are you international? When are you international? Google, where I was for many, many years, prided itself on trying to get to 50% international growth, right, in revenues from international, as fast as possible, right? Yet the converse is here, again, in that economic divide, for most of the people who supported Trump, it was much more about how do I protect the job I have, whereas I think Silicon Valley sees like a irreversible trend that technology leads to openness and the need for new economy jobs and, you know, service-led jobs and knowledge-led jobs even more than service-led jobs. So that's the other key piece, I think, of this divide.
I think the points that have been made, I in some ways agree with, but, you know, I think a counter critique to the openness that was just described is a lack of openness to diverse ideological perspectives or,
I totally agree with
or
that, by
cultural
the way.
perspectives. I mean, how many people are we talking to who lead and live very different lives, live in very different communities than we do? And so I think this echo chamber, either in our social lives online or in our interpersonal work relationships in person, we discovered as a country that we are very disconnected from how other Americans live and exist on a day-to-day basis. And that's a problem and will only exacerbate and grow larger if it's not addressed. And so I think that's one point that led to the disparity or the disconnect for many people.
Can I just add that Silicon Valley is the tail that wags the dog economically. Like without Silicon Valley in the last 7 to 8 years, economically speaking across the US, we would be in big, big, big trouble. So that when we're talking about prosperity and we're talking about those economic chasms that we're currently seeing, that's an issue that we have. And that I would counter the narrative that we have an openness idea, because the reality is that capital flows, product flows, people do not flow. We have a huge immigration reform issue that we need to deal with. And that openness as an ideology is something that we all espouse to do. But the reality is, from this morning, our numbers are terrible in terms of diversity and inclusion. So when we're looking at what this word inclusion, the first time I saw it, knowing that I was going to come here, I suddenly realized, oh, this is the new nomenclature for integration. And that the ideas around integration that we had coming from the 60s and 70s, we still need to embody in some way, shape, or form, but we've actually discarded a lot of those great ideas, thinking that we could do better, rather than having iterated on them. Inclusion is integration. What does it look like to really create an integration plan in which we go from a working class economy to a digital economy? Like, that's the opportunity. And we in Silicon Valley have done a terrible job because we've been looking at the front of the class kids, and as a kid that was at the front of the class, I'll fully say that, like, how those of us who, wanted better educations, whose families strove for us to do better, and the back of the class kids who were supposed to get factory jobs, but the factories aren't here any longer.
So that so sets up kind of the next area. We talked about this before, and then please feel free to jump in. Exactly, kind of one of the big broad questions. When Steve Jobs died, Harold Meyerson wrote in the Washington Post a great column, and he said that Steve Jobs was the iconic American entrepreneur of the 21st century in the same way that Henry Ford was the iconic entrepreneur of the 20th century. The difference is, Harold said, is that Henry Ford created a middle class to buy his products through his workforce. And that Jobs, and not personally to him, but Jobs and Silicon Valley in general did not in the same way, at least not in the U.S. Just not in the U.S., right? And we're going to come to that in a minute about the China part. Can this engine ultimately, can this industry ultimately be an engine of mass prosperity and mass opportunity, or is it always going to be about providing a more limited slice of opportunity for the kids in the front of the class?
The reality is that our educational system is set up to make sure that you fail calculus. Like, that's the way our system is set up. I mean, our current system does not allow for 100% of the kids taking calculus to be successful at it. And as long as we have systems like that, we are not going to be able to break through. I just think so often of family members of mine who are smart, were hard workers, but because they went through a system that really just rejected who they were and the limitations that were put upon them and said, you do not belong here, it just makes it so much harder for them to strive to something bigger. And what would it look like if they had gone through a system that said, you do belong here, we want you to be here, and you're smart enough to learn calculus? That is a very different way of teaching. That is a very different manner in which to engage in workforce development, and we're just not there yet.
Yeah, I would say, and I think we need to remember this, that by and large, I think the tech industry has been insular in creating products for customers it knows, right? And that's true. On the other hand, I think we should not dismiss this point. Technology has been an enabler of small business and small business growth. I mean, let's just look at Google for a moment. The entire AdWords business is predicated on small businesses being able to generate demand for their products. And just think about that for a moment. So the most powerful company, in the world of the internet era, I mean, we'll talk about Facebook in a moment, does in fact seed economic growth for small business and provides them a vehicle globally for them to have trade and services. So I think we just need to not solve this with one swath brush that says technology does not create jobs. Bullshit. I mean, in certain ways it does. The collaborative consumption economy is bringing many people, the ability to earn extra income, and not just in the cities. And so I think it is far more nuanced. I agree. But I think in the companies that have succeeded, I think we have to parse it and say there is the opportunity for prosperity, right? Not all companies are created in Silicon Valley equally. Some will take money out of the pockets of people in rural America, right, to buy goods and services, and others will help create jobs. And I think that is one of the opportunities, right, and create demand for small business. That I think there are technology companies that are examples of driving economic growth. And I think our opportunity is to find those and amplify those examples.
I mean, I think one example we could look at, though, is just the Bay Area itself, right? We don't even have to go to Middle America. We just can go 5 minutes away from here at East Palo Alto, and we can say that, even in places where we have tremendous amounts of tech jobs, that the income inequality really, really has persisted, and in some places gotten worse, and exacerbated by all the other things we've been talking about today, housing, et cetera. What are the examples we can see, if anyone has any, where we do start to see tech companies that are driving? I mean, I'll give the example of one example. When you've got Blue Dot or these things that have delivery services, right? They've got to pack stuff in some places, and they end up generating warehouse jobs. And that doesn't always go well, but there are these other kinds of jobs. Are there other examples you can think of where we are starting to see jobs that are good?
Well, I mean, LinkedIn is another example, right? If you listen to Jeff Weiner speak, he talks about where the growth in jobs is. And by the way, he's not talking about the tech economy. He's largely talking about the need for education in trades and other alternatives. And so I think that there are examples. Again, I'm not here to defend tech. I mean, I just think it's a far more nuanced argument, right? And you have to pick, and to your point, e-commerce generates jobs. I mean, there are places where you can find staffing of a lot of people in manufacturing or other areas. But I think the real, and I will come back to it, I think the real challenge is, and I think this is it, Silicon Valley as a whole, right, places value on knowledge worker jobs, right? That is despite the fact that Google's getting into hardware and that will lead to manufacturing, whatever, as an industry, right, it is predicated on this idea that the knowledge worker is the supreme worker, right? And you will pay a lot to attract that worker, and hopefully he will spawn a multiplier, or she will spawn a multiplier effect.
Okay, so yes, we're really focused on the knowledge worker, but I do think that there is this, if we look 10 to 20 years down the line, there is this serious issue that's about to come, primarily because of automation. And I have this, we talk over and over again over the last 100 years, technology destroys old jobs and creates new ones. It's part of the Ford route, all that sort of thing. But I don't think that's going to happen this time around, and I know maybe one or two of my panelists will disagree with me, but I think when you look at what automation is going to actually do, with not just self-driving cars are just the most obvious one, whether that's 10 years or 30 years away, but it's also there's technologies for replacing baristas, there's technologies for replacing what paralegals do, there's technology that's replacing what even journalists do, and we are entering an era of the economy and of society, I believe, where the vast majority of the human race does not have to work in order for society to function, because automation takes care of most of those things. And and most of our identity and our purpose is tied to our jobs and to our careers. And if you take that away, what happens to society, especially when you're not prepared for it? Because the entire economic system and engine is around your job and you having a thing. 30 years ago, you could have been in manufacturing and pointed and said, I helped make that truck, I helped make that product. It's not the same thing now when if you're in a gig economy, you can't say the same kind of thing. And in another 20 years, none of those jobs might even exist. What's going to happen if we don't proactively solve that problem of there just will not be jobs that are needed for the vast majority of the human race?
I think we need to transform our education, as was pointed out, to be more consistent with the opportunities of the 21st century economy. If we're still based on an agrarian, standard of education that promotes college as the only solution to success, then we are going to be setting ourselves up for success for the dystopian future that was just described if and when machines take over the world. We don't want journalists to be out of work, so we want you all to be gainfully employed. But the rest of America, I think that there has been this wave of interest in artificial intelligence or work displacement throughout the centuries. In 1900, 41% of the economy was agriculture. In 2000, it was 2%. There are lots of people in this room who have found gainful employment that doesn't require you working on a farm. So economies in our country and other countries have made changes and evolved over time. Is this time different? You have had people throughout history who have made that claim that this time is different, and they have been wrong. So perhaps there are signals with artificial intelligence that point to a massive dislocation of jobs sometime in 10 to 100 years, perhaps. But I think we need to train young people. This conversation about retooling, retraining older workers, I think that's far more difficult. That's a far more difficult conversation. What we can focus on is transforming the education system so that a young person with a smartphone and access to peer-to-peer technologies can become an entrepreneur and create their own opportunities.
We're going to bring in the audience for questions, but I want to throw up one slide. I think we have a slide here. It kind of goes to Ben's point. We're somewhere on this trajectory. It was a calculation recently done by the publication The Information, looking at how many employees these different companies had at the point they reached $200 billion in market capitalization. And obviously Amazon, is in a different place, but it is a very stark. You can generate that level of wealth with so many fewer employees in the new construct. I mean, that really is kind of a dramatic number. Is that kind of the trajectory that we're heading toward?
I do argue that it is different. And when you see numbers like that, you're seeing that concentration. You do not need as many people to generate as much wealth,
right,
as much resources, as much knowledge as you did in the past. And look, it's not a dystopian future where people don't have jobs. It actually could be a very good thing in the sense of what automation does is open people to having more time to do the things they actually want to do, whether it's being artists, creativity, education, whatever they want to be able to do. We just don't have an economic system that is built or designed for it, because we can't even conceive that is what the future might possibly be. And if we're not even thinking about it, that's where the issues actually happen.
Garrett, hold that thought. Let's bring in the audience, because we want to leave time for a robust conversation, and you can add it as people.
So Roy Bahat with Bloomberg Beta is doing a lot of research on this. We had him for an event on Monday. He has done focus groups with truck drivers in Middle America, and when he raises the question of, do you want a UBI? Do you want this type of government transfer? They say no. We want jobs. Yeah. And that's going to be a big disconnect.
Yeah.
All right,
issue also, can I just add
sure,
to this?
please, yeah.
The issue that we have also culturally is that when you're talking about a jobless future, I know what joblessness looks like right now. I have families who are jobless, and that looks like poverty.
Right.
So that when you're talking about this amazing future, for many of us, joblessness does not look like going to Tuscany to do watercolors and draw.
No, I agree.
So that,
I agree.
and more importantly, we've also been on the brunt end when you're talking about welfare reform and being welfare queens and all of those things, so that when you're talking about a universal income, without a cultural context, you're not selling it to us. So when you're talking to those truck drivers, the question should be, if we train you to have a fleet of trucks so that you all can be driving 5 or 6 trucks at the same time and be making good money, would you buy into that? That is the question that they should have been asked. It isn't, can you replace yourself and do you want to be replaced?
Right,
it's how do you want to transform, how do you work with the tools that you already know how to work with?
Let's go to the folks in the audience. Do we have questions?
James Hines from the Athletes Council. We're basically focused on using older, experienced athletes to encourage student athletes on their college-bound journey. I think the panel on the gentleman on the far end and the lady who just spoke are echoing the same things, but from different point of views. But let me frame it this way. When we say a jobless future, that doesn't mean, why does it have to mean dystopia or poverty? That's a notion that it could mean as the gentleman I think alluded to, an awesome opportunity for living and exploring life. But to your point, as I'm a gentleman from the South, I'm from Kentucky, I lived in California, I worked across the world, so I get all points of it as 50+ years old. My question is, we have a lot of persons from those areas I just mentioned to who really don't get the amazing point that you said that you can learn calculus. Sal Khan of Khan Academy has proved a point. An excellent teacher can teach anything. We need more excellent people teaching that you can be anything. And that is what's culturally ingrained in most people, that you believe if you're an athlete, you can be this. If you're an actor, you can be this. If you are a person who does this. People don't buy into the notion that you can be anything because, number one, they don't have amazing people teaching them what they can do correctly.
All right, so let's go to the, okay, here we go. You want to respond to that? Or?
No, I think like when you're talking about going from an agrarian system to a mechanized system, the reality is that our school systems are still set up in a 19th century school model, and that we're not, and when we're talking about education reform, we're also not taking into consideration that most public school students right now are Black or Latinx. So it is both a cultural construct that is very different from what the average student used to be even just 10 years ago, and at the same time having to update to 21st century needs, not to teach what to think, but how to think. And it is that difficult conversation that I question. What is that going to look like with the upcoming administration when they've promised people that jobs are coming back, when we fully know that robotics are coming down the line, and what's going to happen when those two things come to a crossroads?
So, I won 2 NCAA championships in college, so I appreciate I appreciate what you're doing. I also have 3 nephews and a son, and I am teaching them, encouraging them to think about entrepreneurship as a solution, not sports as a ticket to success or college as a ticket to success. And so I think it is really a transformation of culturally the way that we socialize our young people in whatever environment that they grow up in, but then also structurally our educational system. How are we going to reframe young people for the future?
Can I just bring this all the way back, though? When you think about that, training, you both said it, training people to be system thinkers, how to think, not what to think, training in entrepreneurship and makership. Like, let's just bring that all the way back. That chart, interesting chart. What it doesn't show is the entire affected economy around those jobs, because that is the thesis of what is one of the more powerful things about technology, right? That you can employ 50,000 people here, but create an entire economy outside of this. So I don't think this is an accurate picture, actually, because I don't think it shows the effect of
the multiplier effect.
The multiplier effect of certain types of technology companies, right? Like, as I said, Google spawned many businesses that would otherwise not be viable. I can't say the same thing about Facebook. Apple spawned many companies out of the app economy. Now, you have to ask yourself, do those spoils go disproportionately to people who already are inherently entrepreneurial or system thinkers? That may be the educational problem, right? Which is, even to take advantage of these technologies, if you're not living in Silicon Valley but somewhere else, you need a new set of training to be able to take.
Well, the multiplier effect has been, fairly consistent, that you get, for tech jobs, you get a few more jobs in the economy. But even if you multiply those numbers, you don't get.
I understand, but my point is, it's not an apples to apples comparison, right? Firstly,
or
again,
Apple to Ford.
Apples to Ford.
In this
And
case,
for certain types of tech platforms.
The only other point I want to add is part of what has happened is, I believe, a failure in education overall. And we think a little bit too much about the education K through 12, which does need lots of reform and needs to be moved into the new century, but it's also the continued education that is just not happening, where it's just not happening across the board. And that part of the result were the people's educations are coming from Facebook and fake news as a result of that. And they're not using the critical thinking skills to be that doesn't make sense for some kind of logical reason, and not being exposed to other ideas. Part of the beauty of college and even in high school, and that is you're exposed to other people, other ideas, forced into other interactions, and that's not happening as much. And the education stack there's just no education stack once you go past college.
Let's come back.
Trump University is coming to a city near you.
Whether you like it or not.
Here.
Hi, I'm Dolores Bernardo, and I'm a Silicon Valley resident, and I work at Airbnb, and I'm in learning and development. I'm curious, you've already kind of touched on it, but when I think of Silicon Valley from a learning perspective, I think of our mindset, which is adaptability, critical thinking, that open mentality that Sukhinder talked about. And I wonder what's our role in helping kind of entire states who might not be open to this type of thinking, kind of get in that way of thinking. So I'm curious, what is our leadership role in that?
Well, I think you hit on it, Dolores, and I think, well, there's a couple things. So when I talked about Silicon Valley being open and we talked about the critique of that, I think we should all identify one thing, which is one of the flaws of Silicon Valley is they only want to solve really large problems. Okay, so in some ways we skip over the state, we skip over our cities, we skip over local problems because they're not big enough, right, to go solve some world problem, while in our backyard, right, we're flailing. And I think that's part of the very just criticism. So I think when we think about these, if there is a silver lining to kind of the change in administration, I think for the first time Silicon Valley sort of opened its eyes and said, gosh, like, you can't talk about being a part of a society where you're trying to solve problems in China, yet you're not trying to solve problems at home. And so I do think when, to date, we've been dependent on the benevolence of certain large tech companies to engage, whether you are Google.org or whether you're Facebook and you're moving into Menlo Park, East Palo Alto, and you need to do something because you're going to have a campus there. I think we have to find some structural way to incent technology people into kind of solving city and state problems, right? And how do you attract the best talent to that? And I think it may take other vehicles, whether it's the Teach for America type model for Code for America. There has to be some incentive structure where we can send smart people to work on these problems, right?
Well, to the governmental point, 30 seconds on it is, a lot of other places are trying. You go all over the country. I've done 2 trips for the Atlantic to about 15 different cities, looking at the types of things we're trying to do to incent the kind of technology job growth that we've seen here. And there are some successful examples, but it's usually places that already have the assets. Like Pittsburgh has done really well, but they also have Carnegie Mellon, which turns out to have been done exactly the right kind of research for today's sort of robotics world. So people are trying. I think somehow, sometimes I think we attribute too much to the mindset and not enough to just like luck and money.
And vehicles.
Historical luck.
And vehicles. You have to make it easy for people to want to do that. I mean, Teach for America is an interesting model, right? They made it easy and attractive for smart young people to want to engage, right? And we have to find models.
I work in 7 cities across the U.S. I have an entrepreneur in residence in each one of these cities that's a tech founder of color. And it's also been fascinating for me to travel across the U.S. and be working in places like Detroit and Nashville and Durham and Chicago and Austin, Minneapolis, and here in San Francisco, and realizing that they don't want to copy our systems. And I'm like, yay for you. They have no interest. They're like, we want to build technology based upon our own needs. More importantly, most of those businesses need to be cash flow positive quickly because they don't have a whole bunch of VCs up the street that are going to be like, how much do you want, And they're building real value. They're building real revenue. They're hiring people. These are the challenges that they're meeting head on, and that's the great opportunity. And I just look forward to maybe seeing something like this in rural communities where people also see the opportunity for them to build something. But this is the other counterpart of it all. How many job recs do big companies have right now open? We're going to have a job gap. I think the number is 300 million. I always get that wrong, so please Google it. But it's a number that's so staggering, which is the reason I always forget it, because we're going to need skilled force labor. Like, that's just the reality. We do need coders. We need designers. We need product managers. We need all of these things. And there's jobs currently not being taken advantage of because we don't have a skilled workforce.
Let's go right here.
Hi, Leela Pedersen. Thank you for this conversation. And one of the things that always baffles me when people say that automation is going to put people out of the work is when I drive from my house, I drive over 6 potholes and 2 blocks. And so if that were true, why is that problem not solved? And to your point, how can we incentivize the work on important issues that aren't being solved? And President Obama has said that government often works on these issues because others won't. And so is the solution sending technologists into government? Is the solution incentivizing companies to work on more pressing problems, or is it some combination?
So to the credit of President Obama, he has created an on-ramp for entrepreneurs and innovators, technical and non-technical, to come into government. U.S. Digital Service, 18F. These things didn't exist before he created them. There's nothing like that for Congress. There's nothing like that for the state legislature in California or for the other 49 states around the country. So I think that there is a desperate need for government to open themselves to these types of opportunities. But the tech community is also going to have to get engaged and create a sense of excitement about this and really push the agenda. I think it's very much needed. Also, to the credit of Silicon Valley, Paul Graham, who's founder of Y Combinator, one of his first articles was about economic inequality. Now, he got a lot of pushback because of the tone of the article, but, a few months after that article came out, they launched a program to explore universal basic income as a policy solution potentially to significant job dislocation. So Silicon Valley has, and I think will have an important role to play in these policy discussions, and I think it's an important role that we have to embrace.
We have one last person waiting patiently, so let's see if we can squeeze it in.
Hi. Thank you. This has been a really interesting discussion, but I think I just heard you say that all of us at some point will become or need to become entrepreneurs, and that strikes me as magical thinking. Most people are not entrepreneurs. That's why entrepreneurs are sort of unusual. And we just spent the whole day talking about money being drained out of public education, and now we're talking about how everybody has to be retrained and trained better. We spent the whole morning talking about problems that Silicon Valley has not been able to fix at home. So then to say, but automation is coming and we should send Silicon Valley ideas elsewhere to fix it, just seems, like hubris, like we've reverted to the Silicon Valley stereotype that looks at the successes and ignores the failures.
So I agree with you that not everyone can and should be an entrepreneur. If you just think logically about how an economy where every person was an entrepreneur, it doesn't work. Yeah. You have to have it. It doesn't work just at all. Look, it's great that we have, the fostering this innovation sphere and all that fun stuff. But it does go in the sense where, I see a bunch of college kids that, instead of, finishing up college or going to work for a company and getting training for at least a couple of years, they go off and they try to do a company, and that doesn't turn out into anything because they were not prepared, they had not trained. It was like some hubris. It's the new American dream in some ways.
So I agree with your critique, but I think you missed my point. There's a difference between being a Silicon Valley venture-backed entrepreneur and having a side hustle.
Yes.
My mom always told me, baby, you better have a plan A, B, and C.
Yes.
So while everyone can't start a venture-backed company, while everyone is not going to build an app, people can become more entrepreneurial and think about ways to create value where that they can support their livelihoods.
Yeah, let's give some nuance. The way that entrepreneurism has become defined in the last 10 years is not what we're talking about, because I think that is hubris. It doesn't work for everybody. On the other hand, yes, you should have A, B, and C all at the same time. As my aunt used to say, I used to have 7 jobs, and if you don't have 7 jobs, you're like failing, But there's something about the fact that entrepreneurship across the U.S. is also down 20 to 30% depending on whose stats you believe in, which is also leading to income inequality because we don't have enough people creating new opportunities, jobs, products, and meeting those needs that are currently being unfilled. And you have huge, massive companies that are amassing a whole bunch of wealth, and that's squelching it. And that even if you're working at I don't care what kind of job you have, corporate, government, whatever, you have to have an entrepreneurial mindset when you're doing this work in a 21st century economy. That you need to be advocating for yourself. You need to be looking at new projects and programs. You need to be filling new ways to fill those potholes if you're working in the city. How is it that you do that? Because jobs, as we know it, of being able to come in at 9 and leaving at 5 and being okay with that is no longer enough.
This audience has been very patient, and I don't want to keep them longer, but maybe as a way to button up this conversation and the whole day, one thing we learned in this election, unquestionably, is there are a lot of people who feel that the pathway to opportunity has been closed off to them. And it's certainly true in, non-urban, white working class, small town, white working class communities in the Midwest. It's true in a lot of low-income communities in the biggest cities that are otherwise thriving. So maybe as a final question, at least from my end, and feel free to amend, this is really seen as the capital of opportunity in the country. I mean, this really is the place, as someone said, that more than anywhere else has been, succeeding even when the rest of the economy falters. What are the most important things that Silicon Valley and the tech community in general can do you think, as they go forward to kind of widen the circle of opportunity that they are involved in creating?
Education.
But we're all going to say education, so
Yes.
for just to say something different,
Yes.
I think for the Valley, it's about thinking of problems big and small. I mean, I think the Valley is very self-obsessed with large problems. There are a lot of small problems that, when I say small, I mean important problems in our communities, in our states, that need as much muscle and manpower, right, intellectual manpower as problems across the globe.
I think it's thinking about non-traditional alliances. We've been talking about education reform. That involves charter schools and, all types of various schemes, voucher programs that, depending on where you fall on the political spectrum, you are either for or you are against. Well, those lines are blurring.
Yeah.
And I think they're blurring in Silicon Valley, and we see that they were blurred throughout Middle America. So, looking at how can we build non-traditional alliances.
There's that little symbol that you can look up. It's build, measure, learn. We need to do that culturally. What is it that we're building? How are we measuring it? And what are we learning from it? How is it that we're going to rebuild? That sense of making needs to really be embedded in all the work that we do.
Great.
I mean, from my perspective, tech has enjoyed a very privileged relationship, both with the government and with people at large. There was the brands that these companies had a few years ago, almost all of the most valuable and most trusted brands were tech companies. So we kind of looked the other way when we had people going in and out of Google and Facebook into the government and then back out. Although in other circumstances, we would call that a revolving door. Mm-hmm. And we would say, like, if you saw oil companies doing that or energy companies or agribusiness, you'd say, like, hey, is that exactly how we want these things to run? And I think now that you have a new administration, I think that the tech community has to decide whether they were just sort of interested in the power or whether, and so therefore they're going to deal with any president, and they're going to do that with any president, or that they actually did have some set of values that jibed with the Obama administration and the people who were in that government, and that won't necessarily with the Trump administration. And I think it's going to be I don't know if it's advice, but it's certainly going to be a fascinating test of what the tech industry is, whether it stands for something aside from being an economic.
Tumultuous years, both internally looking and outward looking. So Margaret, if you have some final thoughts for after this terrific day. First, join me in thanking this panel.
Thank you.
And thanks to you for sticking with us.